Financial planning and security can sometimes be seen as a moving target. The rules change constantly, and you need guidance to stay ahead of the market moves. This is the Lebenthal Report with industry veterans Michael Hartzman and Dominic Tavella. We'll break down the news, trends, and overall direction of the markets, telling you what may be coming next, investment opportunities, and what to avoid. Now, here are your hosts, Dominic Tavella and Michael Hartzman.
All right, I'm Michael Hartzman. Today is Tuesday, April 2nd, 2024, and I'm on, as always, with my partner, Dominic Tavella, both of us broadcasting this evening from Long Island. How are you, Dom?
Doing well, Mike. No complaints, other than we're all both here on Long Island, New York. So could be a little bit better, could be a little bit warmer, but we'll take it. Grateful for what we got.
You know, when it comes to the weather, Dom, you get what you get. You don't get upset.
Well, and we're in both an office building, so the temperature and humidity is perfect.
Exactly, exactly. So this is our first podcast after the first quarter of the year. And I can't believe the first quarter is in the books, and it was a pretty good one, Dom. The S&P was up 10.5, the Dow was up 6, and the NASDAQ, which was up 9. Typically, when the market rallies the last couple of years, the NASDAQ's been leading the pack, but I'm kind of encouraged that the S&P actually outperformed the NASDAQ, because I think what that means is that the market now is spreading out a little bit, and we're not just being driven by 7 technology stocks and 2 medical stocks that make weight loss drugs.
It's a welcome sign, Mike. We obviously have been speaking about this for quite a long time, and a couple of issues. Number one, the Magnificent Seven, we're down to the Fabulous Four. A few of those stocks just haven't performed all that well. In fact, have been extremely disappointing this year. So the 4 major stocks have been carrying the NASDAQ part of this. But as you pointed out, the 493 other stocks have done pretty well so far this year. Earnings have held up pretty well. Corporate growth has done pretty well. So it's kind of reassuring to look at this picture in the first quarter. The numbers have been pretty good, but more important, it's been a pretty broad, healthy expansion in all the major indices.
I tell you what, it was also interesting. I was looking at my cheat sheet before the show that we get every week from JP Morgan. And if I would have said to you that communication services was the number 1 sector in the first quarter, okay, that typically happens when the market's doing well. And if I would have told you technology was the 3rd best sector, so okay, I could see that. Communications was up 15 and change. Technology was up 12. But if I said to you energy snuck in between those two, I think you'd be surprised on January 1st. If I said to you, Dom, in this order, it'll be telecom, energy, and technology. I think if you would have made a bet, you might have lost.
And I think I would have, Mike. Now, in all fairness, we did make a bet, and I hate that word in this context. In the fall, last fall, typically energy is a little bit depressed. Energy prices are a little bit depressed before the winter. And it's typical. Driving season, summer driving season comes to a lull. The weather hasn't changed yet, gotten cold. So energy goes into a little bit of a lull. So we look at this seasonally and go, well, that's a good time to add energy exposure to our portfolios. And we typically kind of eliminated in the springtime. And so we have an overweighting in energy, but that it would be the best performing category. Yeah, Mike, that actually took us as a surprise, a pleasant surprise in our case. But yeah, it definitely took us by surprise.
And that, Dominic, was in an up market, right? I mean, now today, and I didn't look at the end of the day, but I looked in the morning, the XLE, the energy index we follow pretty closely, was up, while the rest of the market was down. That's understandable. But to see energy, which is typically defensive, to be up in a rallying market where, the quote unquote experts are saying recession's off the table, interest rates are going down, I think that's what really surprised me the most. Not that energy is not a great sector, you just don't see it going up in concert with these other sectors, that's all.
And again, Mike, we overweighted the sector in our portfolios, as you well know, and we did it for seasonality reasons. But in this case, it was geopolitical events that really kind of pushed it to where it is today as the best performing asset class year to date. And we see what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, with Ukraine attacking Russian energy facilities. And then let's not forget, the Middle East scenario has gotten worse. You can argue progressively worse. And so energy prices have gone substantially higher, and producers and refiners' stock prices have gone progressively higher. We do think that trend changes and starts to roll over at some point, but for now, it's added quite a bit of value to the client portfolios.
But to your point, I think as long as there's unrest in the there's always unrest in the Middle East. As long as this war is going on as aggressively as it is in both Ukraine and Israel, I think this energy volatility may be here to stay for a longer period of time.
And in fact, some major Wall Street firms are predicting that energy prices could be even higher later on in the year. Of course, all of this is geopolitical driven. The economy is holding up pretty well, and energy demand has been holding up pretty well. But we have had a way milder year here in the U.S., but most important abroad, Europe, China. And so demand's holding up pretty well, but it's really been the geopolitical events that have pushed these prices much higher.
We're going to get back to a milder winter in a little bit, because that's part of the show we're doing tonight about the climate. But we can't go into the break without you talking about the rough start to the second quarter, Dom, yesterday and today. So why don't we go over those numbers real quick?
Yeah, and I'm actually going to steal some of your thunder again, Mike. If I would have told you in January of this year that without the Federal Reserve doing anything, we would see interest rates higher, and some would argue substantially higher than where we started in January, and the markets would still be up, would you be surprised?
I would be surprised. I would. However, I'm going to pat both of us on the back. We are on the record for months, going back to the last half of last year, that these interest rate expectations from cuts in March were just unreasonable and really
way optimistic. Way optimistic.
Way.
So we've always been, for the new listeners, new viewers, we've been in a camp at probably plus or minus about 3%, 3 cuts this year. I think we're still in that camp, Mike. You're welcome to disagree at this point, but I think we're still in that camp, Mike. And the market's now coming to realize that 3 cuts is probably more realistic. Remember, starting the year at 5 to 6 cuts. And then there's certainly a camp now saying no cuts at all this year. And that has driven interest rates to go higher, and thus the start of the second quarter, where markets are starting to maybe accept that 3 to maybe no cut scenario might be happening, and the markets are taking a little bit of a breather if we want to be optimistic, a pretty good pullback if we want to be a little pessimistic, but the markets are definitely reacting to that higher interest rate environment.
Tom, I just want to do this. Just clarify for our audience. When you say interest rates, I know what you mean. The Fed has not raised interest rates. So let's be clear about that. So just, describe again what you mean by when interest rates have gone higher.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Mike. So the Federal Reserve controls short-term interest rates, and they have not changed their interest rate policy. In 3-6 months, Mike? It's been, they haven't.
At least
something along those. They were 3 months of pausing and 3 months this year. So let's just say rough plus or minus about 6 months. But the markets are trying to anticipate where interest rates are going to be down the road. So if we focus on just the 10-year Treasury, we started the year at 3.8%. Today, it's almost 4.4%. That's without the Federal Reserve doing anything other than talking. So that interest rate affects what we pay for mortgages. It affects what small businesses can borrow at. It affects what credit card interest we pay. So that's a benchmark that dictates pretty much what we as consumers and businesses have to pay when we borrow money. The higher that interest rate, the slower the economy gets, maybe God forbid into a recession. The lower that interest rate, the more it stimulates the economy, whether it's personal borrowing, consumer borrowing, or business borrowing.
Thank you for that. Thanks for that clarification. So tonight's guest, you mentioned a mild winter. Tonight's guest is Dr. John Berger, who's written a book, Solving the Climate Crisis, Frontline Reports from the Race to Save the Earth. John has his PhD from UC Davis. He's also a graduate of Stanford University and UC Berkeley. So we're really interested, Dom, to hear Dr. Berger's take on this. We've covered a lot of topics. We never covered the climate and really corporate America, Wall Street. It's always bubbling in the background, but I'm really anxious to hear Dr. Berger's points of view and how, we could all finally agree that maybe the climate crisis is something we could deal with and not ignore. It's not a political talking point. So we will be right back with Dr. John Berger. All right, I'm Michael Hartzman, back with my partner Dominic Tavella, and our guest this evening, Dr. John Berger, who's written a book. I want to get the title right, Dr. Berger, Solving the Climate Crisis, Frontline Reports from the Race to Save the Earth. That's quite a title. And it's an important one. So I know your specialty is environmental science. So let's start from, right there. What motivated you to devote your life to the environment, and what motivated you to write this book, Dr. Berger?
It sounds like a simple question, Michael, but I could probably talk your ear off about that. I've really been studying energy and energy technology, as well as the environmental impacts of energy technology, for about 50 years, believe it or not, despite my youthful demeanor. And, I became quite concerned about climate change decades ago, and now I'm intensely concerned about it. And my studies of energy, particularly the renewable, everlasting, sustainable technologies that operate without burning any fuel, my familiarity with that energy set of sources made me feel that there was a potential for solving the climate crisis by rapidly transforming our economy to rely entirely on these clean, everlasting sources. And I began to look into that quite a few years ago. And the more I learned about it, the more encouraged I was about the potential for doing this. And I realized that we have the technological capability of solving the climate crisis. We have absolutely like 98% of all the technology we need to do everything in our economy that requires energy, but to do it with clean energy. And I can talk a little more about that and how you would configure the energy supply system to supply all that energy. The bottom line is that we have this apocalyptic, ever worsening climate crisis, and it's devastating to nature and to human beings. In the process, we're also polluting the atmosphere with conventional pollutants that kill 7.5 to 8 million people globally every year. And 90% of that is caused by burning fossil fuels. So where I think I'd like to go in our conversation is to try to unpack for you how we could profitably solve this ever worsening crisis, but doing so in a way that actually unlocks trillions of dollars in savings and creates millions of new good-paying domestic jobs that cannot be outsourced, at the same time saving millions of lives, as I just alluded to, and species, while we protect public health, our democracy, and the environment. So it's a win-win situation, or a triple or quadruple bottom line, and that is the good news.
Dr. Berger, if we could wave a magic wand and do that, I don't think there's a person on the planet, much less an American, that wouldn't go for it. But as you well know, there's a lot of objections, right? And I'd like to start with the timing or time frame for this conversion from energy that pollutes versus renewable energy that doesn't. What timeline are you looking at? How long would it take for this conversion to do it? And can we all survive, i.e. heat our homes and run our cars during that conversion period?
Well, absolutely. There isn't any pat answer to your question, Dominic, because politics and policy play a dominant role in the answer to that question. And I don't have a crystal ball, and I cannot project how long it will take for this country as a whole and its leadership to wake up that we are just leaving hundreds of billions of dollars on the table by pursuing energy policies that are a dead end and that could be replaced by policies that are generative of economic activity, of economic competitiveness, and of millions of new jobs. Again, I can explain that, but I believe that we are not putting forward policies in the United States that are commensurate with the tragic consequences of unrestrained climate change and disruption. We're seeing that now because we are at an all-time high in terms of our production of fossil fuels. And the United States is the world's leading producer of oil and natural gas and the third largest producer of coal. At the same time, we are trying to move toward a cleaner economy, but we're doing it in kind of a half-hearted way. So if we do it in this manner, then the timetable, Dominic, that we're on would perhaps lead to success in 2050. But my contention is, and my book, Solving the Climate Crisis, speaks to the necessity of moving up this timetable and trying to do it as absolutely quickly as we can. And there are different sectors of the economy, for example, the transportation sector, the power sector, the building sector, the industrial sector, commercial sector, residential sector. All of these sectors are on different timetables in terms of the ease and the time span required to modernize them and convert them to sustainable energy. Some of these sectors could be converted relatively quickly. Others have more intractable problems in it. If you ask me, you put my feet to the fire and ask me to take just an intuitive stab at the question, I would say that we could actually do this total conversion by 2040 instead of 2050, maybe 2035. And certain aspects could be accomplished very quickly. The electricity sector could be transformed and is already transforming very, very rapidly. We've seen a large drop in the reliance on coal and a big increase in the reliance on solar power, wind power, and the integration of those technologies into our grid. That could be greatly speeded up. We should have a moratorium on all future new fossil fuel development, and that would encourage us to phase out the existing fossil fuel generating capacity in the power sector, for example, because we absolutely have cheaper technology. Solar and wind are cheaper than coal, cheaper than natural gas, cheaper than nuclear. So the sooner we make that switch, the more money we save. It's a no-brainer. We have to do it ultimately for environmental and climatological reasons, but we can also do it for economic reasons because it's beneficial and because today we're spending $1 trillion globally, $1 trillion in the United States on fossil fuels, on the billions of, barrels of, globally it's billions of barrels, but we're spending on hundreds of millions of barrels of oil, trillions of cubic feet of natural gas, and billions of tons of coal. When you add it all up, it's about $1 trillion. The essence of what we ought to be doing is stop setting our money and our fuel on fire and put that money into the clean energy transition. It would make for a very rapid transition if we repurpose this money and also stopped subsidizing fossil fuels.
Dr. Berger, that is as Dominic said, it's an amazingly ambitious agenda. And if you had a crystal ball and we could use it and get this done, it would be fantastic. But I think your frustration must be that there's one political party who basically treats climate change as a joke, as a hoax. And whether that is to make their constituents happy who live in these coal-heavy states, or whatever their motivation is, how do you convince, basically half of America that this is a real problem?
It is very difficult to convince people whose minds are closed on an issue. There are people who are on the spectrum from skepticism or denial about climate change to full understanding of the issue. But people who are unwilling to look at facts, who are not willing to look at data, and are not really interested in what you're saying because their beliefs are woven into their identity and their tribal affiliation, that group of people probably cannot be convinced by logical, rational argument because their views were formed by emotional arguments. But there is sort of an uncommitted middle of the populace that is still amenable to reason and to knowledge. But there are other people who are willing to listen to a troll on social media who maybe hasn't graduated from high school and yet is willing to cavalierly dismiss the findings of thousands of scientists with PhDs in geophysics and climatology. So we need more scientific education in the United States so that people will be able to recognize the difference between anecdote and data. Climate science is built upon data, but if you don't understand the way science operates and you don't understand the importance of data, then it's very difficult to understand the climate crisis and why it's a crisis. If you just value what Joe said on a bar stool and just give that equal weight to the weight of science. So we need more public education and the scientific method. And we need more education of the public in plain, ordinary English to explain what's going on and why we are hurtling toward a climate cliff and there's a climate time bomb ticking. And we don't have an indefinite amount of time to solve this. I've watched this problem evolve for over 40 years. And we have known a great deal about what needed to be done, but the fossil fuel industry has kind of thrown a wooden shoe into the gears, if you will. And through their tremendous political and economic power, they've pretty much sidetracked most meaningful climate legislation, which would hurt them financially. But they seem to be willing to let the world go into an apocalyptic climate nightmare in order to preserve the trillions of dollars of revenue that the fossil fuel industry enjoys on an annual basis.
Dr. Berger, but we are one planet, right? I think we can all agree on that statement. And you look at what's going on in China, where they literally have over 1,500 coal-fired plants and literally are scheduling another 1,500 over the next decade. India, with over 700 coal-fired plants, also scheduling another 700 new coal-fired plants in the next decade. At the end of the day, those are the two largest populations on this planet. They aren't even getting the hint about doing something positive in terms of climate change. How do we even put a dent in this as a planet?
I have an approach. I don't have a magic wand, unfortunately, Here's my approach. There was a political organizer some decades ago by the name of Saul Alinsky, and he had a famous saying, "Start where you stand." We are not Chinese and we're not Indians, we're Americans, and we don't really have the power to tell China what to do. What we can do, what's within our sphere of influence, is that we can make the United States a model of energy sustainability and clean energy and energy efficiency. And we can show the world that A, is possible, and B, we're going to save trillions of dollars in doing this. And it will be profitable to everybody, perhaps, but the stockholders in the fossil fuel industry companies. So we have got to make the United States an example. Then we can go and exhort other countries and tell them that they ought to not build coal power plants and that they ought to convert their economy to something resembling what we've done. But when we are the world's largest producer of coal and oil, and I'm sorry, we're the largest producer of oil and natural gas and third largest in coal, that we've undercut our own moral authority, and it's difficult for us to exhort. The other way to look at this, by the way, is that the United States, China, and India make up roughly half of all of the global emissions. That's a fairly small group of nations. So if we somehow can figure out how to provide the resources so that India and China, the resources, not meaning that we fund China and we fund India, but the intellectual capital and the demonstrations to sort of lead the way and show how this can be done, then I think this problem can be substantially addressed quickly. There's a lot of marginal moving pieces here that will take a while to mop up, but the notion of building more coal power plants in today's amidst the climate crisis of today makes no sense. My view is, in terms of the United States, that we need a national climate emergency declaration, and that would kind of light a fire and help create a national mobilization to speed up this transition that we have to accomplish to a clean energy economy. It's inevitable. And the longer we dilly-dally, the more money we leave on the table. Because I explained already, we're spending $1 trillion a year on fossil fuels. And then we are also providing $646 billion of explicit and implicit subsidies to the fossil fuel industry within the United States. It's absolutely beyond me why we are handing billions of dollars of taxpayers' hard-earned money to wealthy, mature industries. We are actually paying for what we don't want in terms of climate destabilization, floods, droughts, bomb cycle hurricanes, and so forth, and all kinds of other fundamental threats to the climate system and to civilization as we know it. Because civilization as we know it evolved in an equable climate similar to the climate that we have now, but the one that we're rapidly disrupting and could disrupt in a tragic and catastrophic sort of apocalyptic way if we're not careful, because of what are known as positive climate feedbacks, where we release stored carbon in the form of CO2 and methane in the permafrost of the Arctic, and that begins to emerge into the atmosphere and cause further warming and further thawing of the permafrost. So there are other positive feedback cycles like this and thresholds that we can cross, where there's no turning back. And that's what we mean when we talk about a climate precipice and why we have to avoid it.
Dr. Berger, let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back to continue this discussion in a few moments.
Okay, I'll wait till you pose
All
it.
right. I'm Michael Hartzman, back with Dominic Tavella, my partner, and Dr. John Berger, the author of Solving the Climate Crisis Frontline Reports from the Race to Save the Earth. And Dr. Berger, you alluded to it a couple times, and Dom and you were going to get into it in a few minutes. The best way to convince someone, I think, is either through their stomach or through their wallet. And you know, in for what we do for a living, Dr. Berger, it has to be through their wallet. And a couple of years ago, Dominic and I got a ton of phone calls. How do I invest in EV companies? You know, everyone wants to buy Tesla. Everyone wants to buy their competitors. And in the last 18 months or so, all of these competitors that came along to be the next Tesla have not been able to get off the ground. Tesla itself is struggling, and it just seems like the shine has come off of electric vehicles. So it's a two-part question. One, do you think electric vehicles are a good idea? And if you do, what do we need to do to kind of get that momentum back?
That's a very good question. I think EV sales are about 1% of total auto sales, or have been, and now in the last year or so, up to about 7%. Maybe in 20 years, they're expected to be maybe 2/3 of all vehicular sales. The problem right now is that they're very expensive for consumers. And the only way to overcome that, other than waiting till there's just gradual mass diffusion of electric vehicle technology and a gradual increase in the number of charging stations, the only way to accelerate that is for there to be more federal tax credits, more state tax credits to encourage the purchase of clean vehicles. I am definitely.
But Dr. Berger, I don't mean to cut you off, but to that point, the other criticism is that people are nervous about using an electronic vehicle for a long drive, right? The narrative lately is it's a great town car. It's a great car to run errands. But if I'm going from New York to Chicago to see my family and I have to stop 3 times for 45 minutes to charge, that seems to be the other frustration or discouragement you hear more and more.
Well, the latest electric vehicle technology is capable of going 500 miles on a charge. That's farther than I can go with an internal combustion vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
So I think as this technology evolves, it's going to get more prevalent. It's going to get cheaper. We are going to be developing cheaper battery technology that doesn't rely so much on expensive nickel and lithium, but maybe uses more common, readily available materials like sodium and sulfur or other chemistries. So we're not wedded forever to this very expensive battery technology. Battery technology is it was rather rapidly dropping in price, and electric vehicles, when you look beyond the little market vicissitudes, which you guys know very well, but it's like one swallow doesn't make a spring, and you have some setbacks, but the trend is for electric vehicles to become more prevalent, and for the costs to fall. If we want to accelerate that, we have to provide adequate financial incentives to consumers. People may complain, oh, this is big government. Well, there are times when you have a societal problem, a systemic problem that an individual cannot address all by themselves. That's why we set up government, to deal with national defense, to deal with problems that are bigger than the individual. And the climate crisis is precisely such a problem. But we're worried about the taxpayer. Then don't waste the taxpayers' money subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. Take that money and turn it around and provide incentives to use clean power. And also, we should have various measures that would help accelerate the whole clean energy transition. We should have a national clean energy bank, for example. We could issue new clean energy treasury bonds. There are other mechanisms we could use, public-private finance arrangements, maybe a national Clean Energy Finance Corporation to get trillions of dollars that you and I know are sitting on the sidelines in bank deposits. And these trillions of dollars would come out of hiding if they were properly incentivized. When you take $50 billion or so of federal spending and you use it for incentives that bring forth private investment, you can multiply the impact of your federal spending 10 or 20 times. If you just pay down the interest rate for a loan needed for a new clean energy power plant, that's very beneficial. The big hurdle that one faces economically with clean energy technology is, although it's fuel free and the life cycle operating cost of the equipment is less than the cost of the fossil fuel technology, because fossil fuel technology has been around for a long time and costs of producing conventional vehicles have been driven down, and similarly in other technology areas. The problem is it looks cheaper in the moment to opt for the fossil fuel alternative. And that's why clever financing is needed to help overcome this high front end cost. When you build a solar farm, once you've made your capital investment, the fuel is free. And it's also, the price is also stable, because the price of sunlight doesn't go up and down, but the price of natural gas is very volatile. The same with oil prices. So not only do you have the benefit of technology that is domestic and that produces jobs that you can't outsource and that can be good family supporting jobs, but it creates energy security. And the more we move the world away from dependence on fossil fuel, the more we can create a climate safe world and therefore a more secure world. So we'll get benefits in reducing spending on national defense and maybe on climate.
Dr. Berg, I'm going to interrupt you for a quick second because I want to back up what Mike just said.
Sure.
And in full disclosure, we have 3 EVs in our family. The kids love these things. They think they're the greatest things since apple pie and ice cream. But we are having a hard time now convincing consumers that this is the right way to go. Whether it's a shortage of charging stations, whether it's the mileage they get on them, whether it's trade-in value, consumers are starting to wake up and go, maybe this is not the panacea that I thought. And as I imagine that as technology evolves, that problem gets solved to a better solution, but it's going to take time. And it looks like consumers are holding off, going, I'll just wait around till the technology improves.
I totally understand that. And I think that one way we can accelerate this adoption of this new technology is for there to be further massive investment in charging stations, so people don't have to worry about the availability of charging when they take the longer trips that you were referring to earlier. Every concern that you mentioned is a very valid concern. These, however, are concerns that pertain to the relatively early adoption stages of a new technology. And over time, these difficulties will be overcome. As I say, I cannot, use a crystal ball, and I can't tell you exactly when, but I do believe that what you're seeing is a short-term pullback, whereas the long-term trend is towards cheaper EVs. And I think China is pioneering very cost-effective electric vehicles. I don't think they are on the market in the United States, but they show that it is possible to have electric vehicles that have that are very economical to build and to provide. The other thing I want to mention is that I think 80% of all trips in the United States are under 10 miles in length. There's a great deal of travel that we can accomplish with even neighborhood electric vehicles that maybe don't go more than 25 miles an hour or 30 and that are safe on neighborhood streets. Maybe we don't need a $40,000 vehicle to go down to the store for a 6-pack of beer. Maybe it'd be better to ride a bike or to walk if it's close by, or to use some smaller electric vehicle like an electric scooter, even an electric motorcycle, or these neighborhood vehicles that I'm talking about. One size doesn't fit all, and we're not being very prudent in our spending on the internal combustion engine. We're not investing enough in public transit, but the capital that's tied up in motor vehicles, it sits idle for about 95% of the time, either in a parking lot at work or in your garage.
So Dr. Berger, to that point, you just took my next question. Dominic and I were once meeting with a very prominent portfolio manager. It's on TV frequently. She's quoted frequently. And she said to us that in 50 years, people will not even need a car to own because there'll be driverless technology. To your point, you're going out to dinner, you're going out for a nice dinner, you take your phone or whatever device it is at that time, and you have a Mercedes-Benz, you have for the evening. You got to do your grocery shopping the next day. An SUV shows up in your driveway. So how much does driverless technology come into your plan to save the climate if this person's right? And individuals may not even need a car, as your point, 90% of the time we're not even using them.
I think that we could avoid a lot of climate disturbing emissions by making wiser decisions when we develop new towns and new cities, and when we modernize the cities that we have. If we provide people with ample transportation alternatives and public transportation systems that are interconnected so that people can make multimodal transit shifts without having to go outside the system or get another kind of fare card. We make these public transit systems affordable and efficient, clean and modern. More people will shift from reliance on a personal car. There are some people already who have decided to go carless. We need to try to make cities more pedestrian friendly and more bicycle friendly, so that there are good alternatives, so that if you want to ride a bicycle, you can ride on a bikeway that's separated from traffic so you don't take your life in your hands, and so forth. Safety is a primary consideration, quite rightly so. So this urban design is important. We need to co-locate places of work with residential areas so that it's not necessary for people to do what they commonly have to do in the part of the country where I live in California, driving long distances from home to work because they can't afford to live near work and the job is in the city, but the affordable home is somewhere in the suburbs. So a great deal of time and fuel and carbon emissions are in play unnecessarily because of that. That's a problem in urban design that can't rectify overnight, but it could be rectified over time by more dense urban infill development and so forth, and less suburban sprawl and less building on greenfield sites and more redevelopment of existing urban areas that are already at low density but have already been built upon. I talk about some model cities in my book, Solving the Climate Crisis. I went to Western Europe and visited with people in Denmark and Stockholm, and I traveled elsewhere in the Netherlands, and I saw how easy it is to get around with public transit and by foot and bike because of the way cities were designed. And we see in the Netherlands, when they develop a new neighborhood, they make sure that it's very close to public transit and that there are places of work and places to live co-located, so you don't unnecessarily have to boomerang back and forth every day between the two. Does that speak to your concern a little bit?
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you would agree that because of the higher energy prices in Europe, that we'll pick on that for right now, they're far ahead of us in terms of using renewables. And I think they've done a way better job of integrating that into their economies. But in this country, the cheapness of natural gas, as an example, very difficult to get even a solar panel farm or a wind farm. To get one of these things built, financed, and getting the energy output, it's very difficult to get one of those up and running and make it cost effective. So how do we overcome those kind of hurdles?
I'll tell you, my solution is that we need a national carbon fee and dividend program in which we would have a fee at the wellhead for the fossil fuels that are produced. This would sort of level the playing field between the subsidized fossil fuels and other cleaner technologies. Right now, the costs of fossil fuels in terms of the environmental damage is not reflected in the price of the fuel. If we add a fee to the price of fossil fuels that is commensurate with the damage being caused, we can then adjust our spending decisions at home and in the corporate and business world. And then we can rebate the proceeds from this fee and dividend to low and middle income people so that they are not financially penalized, but nonetheless, they would be aware with every purchase that there are costs that our fossil fuels are creating that we are not actually bringing into the market sphere. And therefore, here's another savings, Dominic and Michael, that we haven't talked about, but I think is implicit in what I'm saying, that we will save hundreds of billions of dollars by the clean energy transition in terms of avoided disaster response expenses and humanitarian funds and rebuilding after disasters. The United States in 2023 had 28 $1 billion disasters costing this country a total of over $92 billion. And that's in a single year. That's something that is due to the combustion of fossil fuels to a very large degree. These are climate-related disasters, and they're going to get worse unless we move much more rapidly away from dependence on fossil fuels and to clean energy sources.
So one source we haven't talked very much about is water. You know, obviously, you know, there are dams around the country and around the world. But is water an underutilized resource in terms of trying to fix the climate crisis? And we have about 4 minutes before we have to end, Doctor.
Water is being used in the form of hydropower, and it's a very important renewable energy source. It's also valuable as a source of clean energy storage because water can be pumped up a spillway when energy is plentiful, and that water can then be stored in a dam and allowed to run down through the turbine generators to generate power when it's needed. Electrical storage in the form of electricity is typically expensive relative to the storage of heat, for example. But here we're taking electricity when it's plentiful and using it to create potential energy in the water held behind the dam in the reservoir, and we can recover that when it's needed. There are other ways to store energy, but most of the very best sites for hydroelectric development have already been developed. There are ways in which dams can be repowered, but some dams that are not economical and that are costing more in terms of their environmental damage than their energy benefits could be removed without penalizing society and depriving it of useful resources.
Doctor,
Dr.
before we
Berger,
go, just why don't you tell our audience how they could get your book?
I'll be sure and send you one. I'll be happy to.
No, we're happy to have it, but how do you, if our audience wants to purchase your book, how would they go about that?
Oh,
Where can they
sorry.
find it?
Sorry. Well, it's actually available in independent bookstores and pretty much every bookstore, and it's online. If you looked at Amazon.com or you go to one of my websites, which is solvingtheclimatecrisis.us, or even my personal website, johnjberger.com. Solving the Climate Crisis probably shows you the biggest range of, options for getting the book.
Thank you. Dom, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I just one real quick one, and I apologize because we could literally spend hours in this conversation, but any quick thoughts on hydrogen? It seems to be the new solution coming down the pike. Is it a solution? Is it part of the answer?
Yeah, 1 minute.
Hydrogen is important for storing energy, and it's also an important substitute for coal and natural gas. It's not an energy source in itself. It has to be produced by, for example, the electrolysis of water is one way you can produce hydrogen cleanly. Hydrogen can also be produced from natural gas, but then you have the production of greenhouse gas in the form of carbon dioxide. So that's not desirable, but it has a very important role to play in a clean energy economy, and also important in the steel industry for decarbonizing the production of steel.
Dr. Berger, thank you for your time. Thank you for taking time at the middle of the day. We know you're in California. We appreciate your time and your insight this evening.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting
Thank you.
me.
Have a great day, and thanks for your thoughts.
Nice talking with you guys. Goodbye.
Thank you. We'll be back next week with a new edition of the Leventhal Report. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night, all.